Hey guys, welcome back to We're Talking Movies. This is Cade, joined by Andrew, and today we are going to be reviewing The Conjuring 2 from 2016. Andrew, do you want to start off our pros?
Sure. Let's start off with just the plot of this movie. And while it is similar to the first movie, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the cons section, I do like that this movie is still different from the first movie in some of the perspectives from the family events. Basically, the first movie was told more from the parents' perspective. This is much more from the kid's perspective.
Yeah, and I think part of that might be because in the first movie, when you had the Perrin family, the main target of that movie was Carolyn, the mother, whereas in this one, the main target is Janet, who's one of the daughters, and you mainly get to see it through her perspective, and also I think her sister Margaret. Again, it does make sense because of that, so that's definitely a change to the formula that I enjoy seeing. Also, in terms of where the movie mainly takes place, I really do enjoy the change in setting. Instead of the main storyline taking place in New England again, where Ed and Lorraine Warren are from, the movie takes place in Enfield, which I enjoyed. I also really liked how the house felt a lot different from the house in the original. In the first movie, the house that the Perrin family were in felt a lot more open and more remote, and that's definitely not the case with this house.
Yeah, no, this is, very tight, very cramped. A lot more, it also looks a lot more like run down, as opposed to the house in the first Conjuring, which was a little run down, but still had that sort of old New England charm to it, which makes it seem like a little bit more of a trap to kind of lure people in. Whereas this place is more like you're already trapped in there.
Yeah, and what I also like, adding on to how you said that it was felt a little bit more crammed, yeah, it definitely felt more claustrophobic than the house in the first movie. And because of that, I think that was a great way to build more tension inside the house.
Yeah, that's really is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think another highlight that I want to bring up would have to be the jump scares and just all the horror elements. Now, what I like about this movie is how it's not a film that relies so much on jump scares to be scary. And that's an issue that I honestly have with a lot of horror movies. The thing is, just in my opinion, if you rely so much on jump scares like every couple of minutes, then it just gets kind of repetitive. With this movie, it doesn't rely so much on jump scares. I think that James Wan and the team did such a great job building the suspense and creating tension, like I mentioned, because of how claustrophobic the house feels. And one sequence in particular that I think is a really great example is when we see Ed communicating with the spirit of Bill Wilkins through Janet. I think that that's a real standout in the movie.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one. And one that always comes to mind for me is the final sequence of this movie where Ed is kind of blinded by the steam burns he receives and kind of has to work its way through the house half blind. And you just know that there's going to be something waiting around the corners, but you don't know when it's actually going to show up. And while that does kind of constitute a jump scare, this movie does jump scares well when it does have them.
Yeah, and I think if I had to bring up another sequence that I really like, I've always loved the sequence where Lorraine goes into her and Ed's office, and then we see the painting of Valak, where we then hear the music, and then we see the shadow appear, and then it just jumps out at her with the painting in front of it. That, in my opinion, is one of the best moments in the entire movie. And I think it's a moment where James Wan really shines as a director.
Yeah, that's another really, really good sequence and something you hadn't really seen before. I mean, other horror movies have done, jumping out of the shadows, but jumping out of the shadows while holding a painting to kind of be your face, that's pretty damn original.
Yeah, and despite me saying that it's a movie that doesn't rely so heavily on jump scares, it still does have quite a few in the movie, but I think that they're done really well, and I think they're utilized well. One jump scare that I can think of that I've always really liked is when we see Janet trying to watch the TV, and then right behind her, we see Bill's spirit pop up. That jump scare, I think, is definitely a standout.
Another one I totally agree with. I also really like how he pops up in the screen and then she turns around and then he pops up and he's like right in her face and he's like my house.
Yeah, and aside from all the horror elements, another standout for me would have to be the performances. I do want to highlight especially the performances of Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga as Ed and Lorraine Warren. Not only do the two of them have really great chemistry together, they do such a great job making the pair seem like such decent people who want to help others. And because of that, they're characters who you can root for in a horror movie, which is nice.
And I completely agree. I think, honestly, The Conjuring is probably one of the franchises with the best acting in horror movies because, as a pair of people who watch a lot of horror movies, we've seen some really bad acting in horror movies. So, a franchise with good acting is always something nice to see. And I completely agree. I think Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga are very good in this movie. much like they were in their first one. Again, they have really good chemistry as husband and wife. You can clearly tell that, they really do care about each other and they're very important to each other. They may not be the most accurate portrayal of the Warrens in hindsight, but just very good acting across the board in this movie. Again, outside of the Warrens, you have obviously got the Hodgson family. Now, primarily we focus on Peggy and Janet and Margaret, I think is the three that get the most attention. But even in the other Hodgson kids, they don't get as much of a focus. The acting is still really solid across the board in this movie. Everybody comes across as genuinely scared without seeming like they're maybe going too far and overselling it. And that's another thing that personally annoys me about a lot of horror movies is people overselling being scared to the point that it becomes an unintentional comedy.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of the performances, Frances O'Connor, I think, does a really great job as Peggy Hodgson. And another standout was definitely Madison Wolfe as Janet. She did such a phenomenal job in the movie. I think that she does such a great job playing this very terrified young girl, but when she's also being possessed by Bill's spirit, that's another standout when it comes to her acting. That sequence where she and her sister are sitting on the couch being interviewed and then Bill just takes over. I think that she did a really good job there. And I think that it's a smart move for this movie to follow mainly from the perspective of Janet because, she's the one being targeted primarily. And because of that, by following it through her perspective, we're able to get more invested in her character because of that.
Yeah, and child acting is another thing that's either really, really good or really, really bad. I think this was definitely a really, really good performance by the actress playing Janet.
Yeah, and another highlight that I definitely need to bring up, can we just appreciate James Wan's direction? James Wan has easily become one of my favorite horror directors working today. I love the first Conjuring movie. It's one of my favorites. This one's also a movie I really enjoy. I'm also a fan of his other movies like the first two Insidious films or even the original Saw from 2004. James is a very talented director in general. Not only does he know how to set the tone and build suspense, but he's also really great at getting great performances out of his actors, like we mentioned before. And I think that's probably why he's had so many great collaborations with Patrick Wilson.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes to show how important his direction is to this franchise because whenever we do get to covering the third Conjuring movie, the one that he did not direct, there was definitely a very distinct dip in the quality. So I think his direction is very, very important to this franchise and this movie. And he does a very good job. There's some very, very nicely done tracking shots in this movie. The one in particular that always comes to mind is like the first like supernatural event where the camera starts tracking through the Hodgson house until everything finally starts going a little screwy. And then you've got the scene where Janet gets sucked through the floor into the locked room. There's a lot of very, very good direction and very good cinematography in this movie. And that is something I will always appreciate.
Yeah, I totally agree. But what's another pro that you want to highlight?
This is going to be a really weird thing to put as a pro. I love the credits in this movie. Now, I know that, again, that sounds absolutely bizarre, but I love the fact that they included actual recordings of evidence that Warren's actually collected and actual pictures. I think it kind of goes to show just how well they did it at adapting this. And also, I think it just kind of adds another layer of creepiness that, like, yeah, this is based on a real thing. I know we say here based on a true story all the time, but very rarely does it actually like punch you in the face with the actual evidence of the true thing.
Yeah, and I think it's another thing that makes you understand just how passionate the filmmakers are.
Indeed.
Tell you what, why don't we move on to our cons now? Do you want to start?
Yeah, and I think this is one that you and I both agree on. This movie is a little too similar to the first one because think about it, it's a family in a house dealing with a haunting. It's some kind of vengeful spirit. There's a lot of similarities between the first two Conjuring movies.
Yeah, I will acknowledge that this movie and the first movie have pretty similar plots. We, like you mentioned, we do have another haunted house story where the Warrens are trying to help this family that's being terrorized. Like the first movie, you see it explore possession. Ed and Lorraine are trying to gather proof. So, yeah, well, I do like this movie and I like the changes that it makes to the formula that work really well. I will admit that it does what unfortunately a lot of sequels do, which is tell a pretty similar formula to the original.
Yeah, and it does do a good job at telling that similar story. But when you put them side by side, there's like, yeah, there's a lot more overlap than maybe you would like to see for a sequel.
Yeah, and I think if I maybe had another con, This might be an unpopular opinion, who knows? But I've actually never really been a fan of the Crooked Man. And this is obviously one of the forms that the true villain of the film, Valak, takes apart from her appearance as the nun. And while I don't necessarily hate the design of the Crooked Man, to me it just kind of felt like an extra element that wasn't really needed. I do know that there were plans for a Crooked Man solo film in the Conjuring universe, and if I remember correctly, I think it was canceled a couple of years ago. But yeah, that's always just been kind of a con for me. Again, not because I necessarily dislike the design, it's just felt like something that wasn't really needed.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that. I'm not as critical on it because it's not a huge part of the movie. If it maybe had a little bit more screen time, I would maybe agree with you a little bit more. Only other con I really have is yes, this movie doesn't use a ton of CGI, but when they do, it does look a little rough. The one that always comes to mind is when Valak is being sent back to hell and she kind of like blows away as a dust cloud. I always thought that didn't look amazing. Again, it's not a huge issue, but it's noticeable enough.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that. But to wrap this up, what would you give this movie on a scale of 1 to 10?
It's a good question. I would say I like the first Conjuring more, but this is still a very solid sequel with some genuinely really good scares and some really good acting across the board. I'd say a solid 7.5.
Yeah, I think for my score, I'm probably going to give it an 8 out of 10. Like you said, I don't like it as much as the first movie, but I think it's still a very good sequel and I still enjoy it a lot. So yeah, I'm going to have to give it an 8 out of 10. All right, guys, that's the end of this review. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you later.